Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairwoman. I'm very relieved to hear that you only have a little bit to bridge to your coffee break. So it's only me between you and your coffee break. I would like to talk a little bit about peace as horizon of tolerance and dialogue, because I think it is important on this day to analyze a bit more what Hajj Effendi Fethullah Gulen has to say about this notion of peace, and also to broaden that notion a bit. So let me tell you the 4 paragraphs of my talk so that you can follow the amount of time that still is left until you can move from here. First, I will sketch how for Muslims, and of course Fethullah Gulen is a Muslim, the notion of peace is immediately connected to their religion, since in Arabic the word for peace, salam, is derived from the same root as the word Islam. In the second place, I will try to make clear that although Gulen's phrases about Islam as a religion of peace may sound not very realistic sometimes, it is based on an analysis of the root causes of violence. And I will show, following my great colleague, Jesuit scholar Thomas Michel, how this analysis of the 3 root causes of violence prompted Gulen to take 3 initiatives to fight these root causes. And the 3 main causes of violence were answered by the 3 main initiatives in the so-called Gulen Movement. In the third place, I want to show that an adequate understanding of peace as horizon of tolerance and dialogue requires a more encompassing notion of peace than just absence of war. And finally, and in that sense I come back, I think, to where my colleague sister Arlene Epic began, I want to show how the spiritual side of the notion of peace, not only inner peace in the sense of tranquility of mind, but also peace with God, is connected with the religious inspiration that moves Gulen in his initiatives for tolerance and dialogue as means towards peace. So my first point, Islam as a religion of peace. As I said, it is important to realize that for Muslims, the root salima, a word that they use when they greet each other, and also in Turkey, assalamu alaikum, is a word that is at the basis of the word Islam as well. In its basic meaning, this word means to be safe and sound, to be unharmed, secure, or to escape from danger. In its second form, sallama, it also means to protect from harm, to grant salvation. And this is what Muslims mean when they pronounce the eulogy on Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May the blessings and the peace of God be upon him. And of course, you all know the religious meaning of the greeting, assalamu alaikum. May the peace of God be upon us, be upon you and upon me. But as I said, the words Muslim and Islam are derived from a different form of the same root, meaning to submit oneself to God. Or, as I personally prefer, a translation that I learned from Afra Jalabi, a Syrian peace activist who now works in Canada, to align oneself to the cause of God. That doesn't sound so passive as to submit oneself to God. This all means that for a Muslim like Fethullah Gulen, the word peace cannot be separated from its religious connotations. In a number of his writings, he makes clear that a true Muslim, therefore, cannot but act peacefully, since this is inherent in the very core of the notion of Muslim. In one of his recent articles, he observes that Muslims in their daily lives, in their greetings and in their prayers, extend the wish to be in peace with the whole of creation. His point of departure is a hadith, a tradition that goes back to Prophet Muhammad, saying, "The Muslims are those from whose tongues and hands other Muslims are safe and sound." Now, you may summarize the whole importance of Fethullah Gulen by saying that he widens the notion of this hadith to say, well, it's not only Muslims who may feel safe, everyone should feel safe. Only then are we good Muslims when everyone feels safe in our neighborhood. Now, of course, when you say this after September 11, many people will think, okay, this is nice, but it is not realistic. So, of course, Gulen is aware of that. In his reaction to the terrorist attacks on September 11, Gulen has categorically denied that these terrorists could ever rightfully appeal to Islam. We have seen a quotation in the film, this video that started the conference this morning. Let me give you a similar quotation from an article that he wrote for the Turkish Daily News on September 19, 2001. Islam cannot be considered a religion that supports terrorism because the meaning of the word Islam is to make peace. The reasons why certain Muslim people or institutions that misunderstand Islam are becoming involved in terrorist attacks throughout the world should be sought not in Islam, but within the people themselves, in their misinterpretations and in other factors. Just as Islam is not a religion of terrorism, any Muslim who correctly understands Islam cannot be or become a terrorist. End of quotation. Now, the major problem with this categorical defense of Islam as a religion of peace is, of course, that there are too many Muslims who interpret their religion as a religion that requires them to defend their faith by using violence. That did come up this morning, so I don't need to go into the details. But I think if you talk about the whole subject matter of religion and violence, and there have been quite a lot of conferences on that, what stuck to me and what still has remained in my mind over all these years is a pronouncement that a Jewish friend of mine back in the Netherlands made. He said, "It is not the divine scripture that determines our approach to peace and violence, but it is our own mindset that determines how we read the scriptures." Let me give his quotation. "Give a moral person a religious text that favors violence, and it will become a text that commands reconciliation. Give an immoral person a text that stimulates love and reconciliation, and it will become a summons to violence." If Tzvi Marx, the name of my friend, is right, and I think he is, then it is not so important to ask whether the Quran mainly favors violence or commands love and reconciliation, since we can find both types of text in that scripture, just like we can find them in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament. I know there are some debates of it, but that's maybe for another conference. So, if it is true that we can find both types of text, peaceful text and violent text, in all foundational scriptures, it is more important to see how someone like Fethullah Gulen interprets such violent text from the Quran. When he discusses some of the texts in the Quran that seem to talk about the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews, in rather stern expressions, he stresses that he wants to remain true to his own style of friendliness and politeness. I quote, "I think that this type of behavior can soften the ideas and change the behavior of those who count on roughness and hostility. In fact, we should try to tolerate even slanders and pressures as much as possible. Therefore, if the Quran says a negative thing such as, 'You who believe, do not take Jews and Christians as allies,' from Surat Al-Ma'idah, Surat 5, we should always presume that it refers to extremists and not to religious people as such." Following his teacher, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, Gulen says the following, I quote, "The Quran's prohibition regarding not taking them for friends pertains only to those matters of belief in Judaism and Christianity that do not conform to Islam. Otherwise, generalizing on rules that pertain to specific conditions, specific people, and specific subjects would mean accepting the Quran differently than it really means. So we should not sacrifice anything from our style." End of quotation. This means we should generalize the sayings of the Quran that promote peace and understanding between human beings, such as the famous verse, "O humankind, we have created you from a single pair of male and female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another." But we should restrict the sayings that seem to hinder peace to exactly those situations in which these words apply. In two fundamental articles on tolerance and dialogue, Gulen makes clear that peace is his hermeneutical key to understand the meaning of the Quran. Since the Quran itself repeatedly says that peace is better, this should be our default understanding of Islam. Gulen says, if we start our effort for dialogue with the belief that peace is better, then we must demonstrate that we are on the side of peace at home and abroad. Indeed, peace is of the utmost importance to Islam. Fighting and war are only secondary occurrences which are bound to specific reasons and conditions. And again, in a summarizing quotation, peace, love, forgiveness and tolerance are fundamental to Islam. Other things are accidental. The second point, 3 root causes of violence and their healing. The foregoing analysis in which peace is seen as fundamental to Islam would be rather naive if it does not lead to an analysis of the causes that hinder Muslims to act accordingly. More importantly, once the root causes of the disease named violence and terrorism have been diagnosed, a cure should be applied to their healing. And that is exactly what Gulen does. He once again follows in the footsteps of his teacher Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, who mentioned three sicknesses that caused the backwardness of the Islamic world in his famous Damascus sermon back in 1911, almost a century ago now. By the way, he mentioned 6, but Gulen took 3 out of them. They indicate poverty, ignorance, and disunity as the 3 basic enemies that Muslims have to fight in order to do justice to their faith. Father Thomas Michel, on the conference in Georgetown, where Dr. Kim was present as well, he was one of the first Christian theologians to recognize the importance of both Nursi and Gulen in present-day dialogues between Muslims and Christians, has shown how Gulen decided to combat these 3 evils through 3 sorts of activities. First, in the 1980s, the battle against ignorance was central in building a great number of schools and other educational institutions. We've heard about it this morning and again this afternoon. Next, in the 1990s, in order to combat disunity between believers and human beings, a number of dialogue activities were deployed both in Turkey and around the world. The Rumi Forum is among the most important of these, I believe. Finally, the beginning of the 21st century saw the beginning of the fight against poverty through organizations such as Kimse Yok Mu, which can be translated as, "Is there nobody who cares?" In this way, the followers of Gulen follow his analysis in developing activities that can be summarized in one Turkish word, and again, Dr. Kim already mentioned it, hizmet, service. And that's also the name of the Gulen movement in Turkey. I'm always a bit embarrassed talking about the Gulen movement because it is my opinion. Well, first of all, I know that Hajj Effendi Fethullah Gulen is not very satisfied with that term. And I also think it leads you in a wrong direction because it is not about Gulen, what we are doing. It is about service. So what they are doing is they open schools to overcome ignorance. They open dialogue institutions to overcome disunity, and they organize charity to overcome poverty. This shows that Gulen's assertion that terrorism cannot be caused by Islam, but by other factors, is not just an empty phrase, but it is backed up by an analysis of the root causes of violence, and moreover, that Gulen has given the impetus to help overcome these root causes of violence by activities in these 3 fields: charity, dialogue, and education. That is why I said at the beginning of this lecture that peace is the horizon of the activities of the hizmet, of the movement inspired by Fethullah Gulen. Very short 3rd paragraph, 4 levels of peace. I'll just mention and not go into the details. I think you can analyze Gulen's talk about peace in 4 levels. The first level is the level that we have been talking about this morning and most of the day, the idea of global and universal peace, the peace between nations, the peace between cultures. The second level is the level of interpersonal and intercommunal peace. How can we live with one another in a good manner? The third level is what Gulen calls inner peace or tranquility and peace of mind. And then the fourth level is what Gulen calls eternal peace as the ultimate goal of human life. And in the fourth and final paragraph of my lecture, I would like to discuss these two last levels a bit more and focus on the spiritual dimension of peace, serenity, and peacefulness with God. Most scholars who have studied the works of Fethullah Gulen in Turkish or in English agree about the fact that his 4 books called Emerald Hills of the Heart on key concepts in the practice of Sufism are probably the most important and certainly the most scholarly of Gulen's works. If one wants to research the core notions that drive his engagement and that of many of his followers, one should consult these sources. By the way, one should listen to his sermons as well. That was the reason why I went to Turkey this summer, apart from the trip that I made with the Rumi Forum in Maryland, and that I'm very grateful for. But I think that is, and again, Dr. Kim mentioned that the followers of Hajj Effendi listened to these sermons and were really emotionally stirred. And that drove his interest, okay, what's happening here? And for me, it was very similar. So that was a kind of a enterprise that I made as well. The original context of these reflections on Sufi notions is a series of reflections under the same title, Kalbin Zümrüt Tepelerinde, which means Emerald Hells of the Heart, on the central pages of Sezinte, a monthly magazine of science and culture. Most of these 2- or 3-page reflections are translated from Turkish into English and published in the English version of Sezinte, namely The Fountain, a magazine of scientific and spiritual thought. Later on, they are collected and printed again in book form, and since Fethullah Gulen is still writing an article of for each magazine, the series of books will keep growing in the near future. Let me explain about these Sufi notions. Their origin is the practice, not the theory, but the practice of Sufism, the mystical tradition of Islam in which the Sufis spent their lives seeking God. Their experiences or knowledge of the heart in doing so are gathered in a number of practical guides for seeking God, well knowing that we can only find God because God has found us before we began seeking. It's kind of a complicated notion, but I think essential for Sufism. The Sufi path is called the Tariqa, and it knows many stages and stations, as they are called. And distinguishing these stages in order to see where you are on the mystical path is a famous organizing principle in mystical texts. If you are familiar with mystical texts, for instance, in Christianity, you will see something very similar. So, in the world of Islam, many authors have tried to summarize and systematize these notions. And I'm somewhat familiar with Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali, who in his famous Ihya Ulum-ad-Din gives a number of these notions. So I don't have the time to go into the details. So let me just immediately focus to the notion of what al-Ghazali calls intimacy and contentment with God. That's, of course, a very intimate, close notion of being with God. In his collection of Sufi essays, Fethullah Gulen talks about 2 notions that are connected with them. It's not salam, because that is a more political notion, I think. In the Sufi notion is sakina, which is translated as tranquility, which might come close to what I just mentioned as peace of mind. But it is a tranquility sent by God. According to the Quran, Surat Al-Fath, He it is who sent down serenity into the hearts of the believers, so that they may have more faith added to their faith. So it is a peace of mind in the midst of trials and tribulations, but its source is recognized as a gift from God. In this respect, it is interesting for me as a scholar of religion to notice that the word sakina has the same root as the Hebrew word Shekhinah, that denotes the indwelling presence of God among his faithful in Jewish mysticism. Even in Arabic, Sakina may mean tranquility, peace of mind, but also the immanent presence of God. The second notion discussed by Gulen, together with tranquility, is itmi'nan, or peacefulness. It is related with a verb form that means to become quiet, to calm down, which indicates that the heart of a believer can be at rest, since it found peacefulness with God. This is indicated in the Quran, Surat Al-Ra'd, as follows: "In the remembrance of God do hearts find peace and tranquility." The third and last notion that I will discuss lies behind these two notions of tranquility and peacefulness. It is the notion of seeking God's pleasure or approval. Seeking God's pleasure is indeed the motivation for Gulen to engage in promoting dialogue, love, and tolerance. In his article about dialogue and tolerance as the two roses of the Emerald Hills, quoted before, Gulen says the following, I quote, "I would like to stress the fact that Muslims will lose nothing by employing dialogue, love, and tolerance. Muslims continuously seek the approval of God, the pleasure of God, and this is the greatest gain of all." Again, this statement about seeking God's pleasure, Rizallah in Turkish or Ridwan in Arabic, is derived from a verse in the Quran, Surat Al-Fajr, that is quoted twice at the end of his article on tranquility and peacefulness. It says, "Return to your Lord, pleased and well-pleasing, and enter the garden of heaven." But the pleasure of God is even greater than the rewards of heaven, as the great female Sufi mystic Rabi'a of Basra reminds us in saying that she seeks God not for the rewards of heaven, but because of God's self. You may know this story where she goes through the streets of Basra carrying a torch in one hand and a basket of water in the other hand. And people asking, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I want to set fire to the gardens of heaven because I don't see God because of heaven. And I want to quench the flames of hell because that is not what we seek. We have to seek God for God's self." This is to be found in the Quran as well, Surat Al-Tawbah. God has promised the believers, men and women, gardens beneath which rivers flow, to dwell therein forever, and beautiful mansions in Garden of Eden. But God's good pleasure, his being pleased with them, is greater still. That is the supreme triumph. I conclude. This notion of seeking God and working for the sake of God's pleasure is, in my opinion, the central notion in Gulen's engagement in tolerance, dialogue, and peace between the nations. It is the final aim of having a tranquil soul, being at rest with God, and feeling intimacy and contentment with God, since God is, I quote again, well pleased with them, and they are well pleased with God. I hope that this final quotation from the Quran, this time from Surah 98, that this final quotation from the Quran not only shows how Gulen perceives his own life as driven by the desire to please God, and that motivates him to service as a central movement, but also how this relation of mutual contentment between God and human beings is already sketched as the final goal for our engagement in peace in the very words of the Holy Quran. Thank you.